And hello, and welcome back to Modern War History. In the last video, we talked a little bit about the French Revolution. We broke it down. We talked about the end of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, and we ended on this rise of a new government known as the Directory. Now, it didn't last very long. They began to fall out of favor. We're going to talk about that. But one thing they did do is they helped to facilitate the military career of Napoleon Bonaparte. So let's talk about Napoleon. Alright, so first of all, Napoleon was not a native French. Alright, so he does become, you guessed it, the French Emperor. Spoiler alert, sorry about that. But he was not actually French. He was born on the island of Corsica, which at the time was, basically, they were like Italian. So he sounded Italian. He was born a noble, but weirdly, he wasn't rich. He was part of what we would call like an impoverished noble class, if you will. So they had, sounds kind of like the middle class in America today. You have just enough money to pay your bills, and that's about it. So his father was a noble for the king and went to Versailles and things like that. So anyway, Napoleon was able to go to military school in France, where he becomes an artillery specialist. Now remember, artillery is our fancy word for guns. So at this point, I'm hoping that we know that. We've talked about the use of artillery for the first time in all the Muslim empires back in Unit 2. But Napoleon specialized in guns. And in particular, we would say probably the placement of cannon here. The placement of cannon. Alright, so he was a strategist. Now, another thing about Napoleon is that he was inspired by great military generals of history, such as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Hannibal. Hannibal was a Roman leader who ended up, basically he was, I'm sorry, he's not saying he was a Roman leader. He was from Carthage, who was a group of Phoenicians that lived in the northern Mediterranean, and he ends up coming around this way and going up here, crossing the Alps, and attacking the Romans from the south, which almost won him the day for Carthage and almost enabled him to defeat the Romans in the Punic Wars. But nevertheless, these are the kinds of people that Napoleon idolizes. His favorite book is the Iliad, which is a story about the great Greek hero Achilles. I think with two L's. So, nevertheless, this guy is all about just being this great general and leading France to great things, or he had really, really high ambitions. Now, he also just so happened that maybe there was a little bit of luck, and he was at the right place at the right time. Literally, there was no one else. Everyone else was off fighting wars for the French, and royalists, which are those who are wanting to reestablish a monarchy in France, were attacking the Directory. Okay, so royalists were attacking. There was no one else there to save the day, and so the National Convention asked Napoleon to protect and defend the delegates that were meeting at the location in Paris. And so he set up the guns with what we call grape shot. Now, we think about cannons, we think about big cannonballs and things like this, but what grape shot does is it spreads out, all right, with almost like a spray, kind of like what you would see with a shotgun, okay? And so it almost has a shotgun effect. And once the royalists started to march on in combat, they got close enough. Napoleon gave the order, and he sprayed them with this basically giant shotgun fire from a cannon, and just completely routed these royalists. So within minutes, they were scrambling, trying to figure out what in the world's going on, and running for their very lives. And so because of this, Napoleon becomes the hero of the hour, the savior of France. Everyone hears about how great he did at running off the royalists and saving the day. And so he really does kind of become a national hero and an icon of a great Frenchman. And so because of this victory, because of this win, Napoleon finds himself in command of an army. Now, he's still very, very young at this point. He's not very old. Some of his generals who are fighting under him are far older and more experienced. But he is sent to Austria, or he's sent to fight Austria in Sardinia. All right, and so he's doing battle against this Austrian Sardinian coalition. Again, no one's really expecting a lot out of them. The enemy here seems to be a little stronger than perhaps they anticipated, and Napoleon always in these early battles is outmanned. So his armies are usually significantly, in some cases, smaller than the enemies he's facing against, and yet he beats them all over creation. Again and again, he has military victory after military victory and just succeeds. He is major key, right? And so, incredible tactician. When we talk about tacticians, he was an artillery. He set up artillery, and so he had to know where to put them in order to make the best use out of them. He could adjust to weather. He could adjust to being having a smaller army. He knew exactly when to use his foot soldiers. He knew when to send in the cavalry to clean up the mess as the army is scrambling and retreating. And so there was all sorts of different ways where he used his tactics, his ability, his incredible tactician skills on the battlefield in a way that was very, very effective for the French. He then went on to, oh, by the way, I almost forgot that the iconic image of Napoleon crossing the Alps is in reference to when he went into war against the Austrians and Sardinians, when he crossed the Alps. The reality of that isn't so glorious as the image, but he was a master at propaganda, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So he goes on to Egypt from there, and he failed militarily big time in Egypt. So he was beat by Admiral Nelson in the Mediterranean. We're going to see this guy come back later on. He also was able to keep bad news about himself out of the news in France. And this here is part of his incredible tactician skills. So not only was he a great general and knew how to do what he needed to do, but when he did lose, he was really good at keeping it out of the press, which is pretty impressive even back then before the internet. So when Napoleon arrived home, he didn't arrive home as the individual that lost out big in Egypt. He rode home as the victorious artilleryman that was able to fend off the attackers on the Directory. He came back as this military genius who was able to rout the Austrian and Sardinian army. And he also came back, again, as fate would have it, at a time where it was kind of the right time. And there was a lot of growing unrest towards the Directory. So, growing unrest towards the Directory. In other words, they fell out of favor of the French. And so they were seen as corrupt. They were seen as not, the French, they want to change again. They're really, really impartial to the Directory. And so Napoleon comes back as this great hero. His brother Joseph kind of encourages him, hey, come on, let's seize power. You can do this. So Napoleon ends up coming back with his armies, and he goes in, he drove out the Directory and established a new government. And this right here, this process here of basically overthrowing the government is a coup d'etat. Now, this wasn't like a battle. This wasn't an intense fight for control. You may see that in some bloody coups, but this right here was actually bloodless. He ends up taking control, and he governs in conjunction with two other consuls. So he calls himself, they call themselves consuls, and Napoleon was first consul. But in reality, he was supposed to, I guess on paper, he was supposed to share this power with the other two consuls, but in reality, he was more or less calling the shots like a dictator. And this was in 1799, alright? So, Britain, Austria, and Russia, they formed a coalition. They teamed up, which is another word for a coalition or an alliance. And they wanted to drive Napoleon out. They still wanted to establish a monarchy. They were still kind of freaking out, even though it's been 5 years or so since the revolution. They really wanted a monarch, and they didn't like Napoleon, and they didn't like his military success and all these different things. And so they attacked, and Napoleon had to go off and beat them back, essentially, which he was successful at doing. Again, usually with an army that was less than the armies he was facing up against. And by 1802, he ends up signing peace treaties with these countries, and for the first time in forever, France is at peace. Europe as a whole is temporarily at peace, and I do say temporarily because by 1805, things are going to happen again. But now, for the first time, Napoleon has an opportunity to make France great again. And so he starts trying to do social and political reform. He wanted to keep the... And also, it's important to know that he has a lot of people to please. A lot of people to please. Remember, we talked about the conservative right and the liberal left. Conservatives didn't want to change anything. They wanted to keep the king. They wanted to keep the Catholic Church. They wanted to, keep their land and their wealth and all these different things that were important to them. The left, and particularly the bourgeoisie, wanted to see themselves benefit because of their hard-earned wealth and things. The peasants wanted to be able to afford food. So all these different things that had happened, some of the things during the revolution were good, and some of them were not so good. What Napoleon was tasked with doing is creating a moderate middle ground, okay? And, which, again, moderate would be in the middle between the radical left and the super ultra-conservative right. So he favored a strong state and also reforms. And some of the reforms included tax reform. All right. Some of the reforms included an end of corruption and inefficiency. So where things weren't working, he wanted to make some changes so that the government was better run. He also wanted universal education to all males, sorry ladies, of all backgrounds. And so this here was kind of a liberal reform, and this appealed more so to the bourgeoisie. He also, one of the reforms was he restored the Catholic Church, which was a big deal to conservatives. All right. And also, this here might be a step in the right direction in terms of getting the approval of some of your other monarchs on the outside. Robespierre got rid of the calendar. He didn't use the Julian calendar. He used a calendar that didn't have Sundays because he wanted to completely erase the Catholic Church. So he brought back in the Catholic Church. However, he does tell them to stay out of French politics. All right. So again, everyone wanted to see the church come back, right? But I don't think too many people there wanted to see the church gain, I guess in the third estate, to see the church gain the kind of political power they had as part of the second estate, where they could team up with the first estate nobles and call the shots. So stay out of all that. He also created the Napoleonic Code. Now this right here was something that he thought was his greatest contribution. All right. But really, it probably wasn't in the grand scheme of things. It was not really liberal reform. It limited the freedoms of many of. It chose, I guess, like an absolute approach over liberal reform. So individual freedoms came second to the power of the government, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Now, in 1804, the dude becomes emperor. All right, so Napoleon actually calls himself emperor. He wants a little bit more validity. He thinks that maybe if he can do this, he'll be more than just a dictator. He'll be respected as somewhat of like a monarch by the other Europeans. And so he ends up having this coronation in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and crowned himself emperor. Now, usually in a coronation like this, the Catholic, the Pope will actually place, will do the crowning himself. But in this case, he crowns himself. And here's an image of him taking the crown from the Pope, and he's about to place it on his, or I guess in this case he's giving the crown to Josephine. But here he is. He's already got the crown on his own head. So he also decides that he's going to sell off his American territory. So, this right here was the territory that the French had controlled. Actually, they controlled really from the Great Lakes down to Mississippi, and established a fur trade. But they actually owned and had, I guess, possession of all this territory in the U.S. that you see here, known as the Louisiana Purchase from the American standpoint, because Thomas Jefferson bought this for, I don't even remember the number. I think it was like $15 million or something like that. At the time, it would have been a ton of money. But he ends up using this to finance European interests. He's thinking, well, if I can give this land to the Americans, not only will this allow me to finance my European interests, but it'll also enable the Americans to always stand up to the British. And at this time, France and Britain had always been long rivals, and he wanted to give them a continual enemy. So even if the English ever did come back and take over the colonies, now the United States has territory of their own in the inland. So this kind of established in his mind the U.S. as a permanent source. He also lost Saint-Domingue, which was basically modern-day Haiti, to rebellion, and thought, well, it's not worth it. Let's count our losses here and focus on Europe. And so he did. Napoleon looked to expand his territory. He ends up, Italy, Netherlands, and Switzerland became part of his territory that he kind of controlled. And as a result, once again, the British, the Russians, the Austrians, the Swedes, they formed a coalition or an alliance against him. And so once again, Napoleon finds himself at war with basically all of Europe. And he was once again unstoppable. He beat them all senselessly. At this point, his army was stronger. He had an elite guard of individuals that had been with him for a certain number of battles that he would call on. They were feared by other Europeans because of their skill. His army numbers had grown a little bit, so in some of these battles he may have actually had higher numbers than his enemy did. And there was a really big, really important battle of Austerlitz, where within several hours Napoleon was able to defeat basically this whole entire, I don't have it written on here, but I believe it was the British, the Russians, and the Austrians concurrently. He defeated them at the same time here, and just a huge victory. Really showed his expertise at artillery and also at being a general. Nonetheless, another thing that's important to note about Napoleon is that he was very much with his army. Let's see, he would charge with them. He would spend time with them in their camps, and they all thought the world of him. Now, here's the thing, though, is that while Napoleon was having all these victories on land, because he was the best on land in terms of land combat, Britain was unstoppable from a naval standpoint. Now, we've already talked a little bit about my boy Admiral Nelson, right? Admiral Nelson was to the water as Napoleon was to the land. So, in the same way that Napoleon was the greatest tactician when it came to land combat, Admiral Nelson equaled that when it came to the Navy. Now, it's also important to note that ever since the Spanish Armada had been defeated by the British during the reign of Elizabeth I, really Great Britain had established themselves as the naval power of its day, of Europe. And they really were that good, but Nelson was just an amazing admiral of the British Navy. And so truly this really kind of inadvertently leads to the downfall of Napoleon. We'll get to that later on. But in the meantime, this right here was the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, I don't even know if I've written that in here, so let me write off to the side here. The Battle of Trafalgar. That should be an A. This right here is a battle that took place as Napoleon was attempting to invade, or he had plans at some point to invade Great Britain, but he was beaten so soundly, so intensely by Admiral Nelson here that he gave up his attempt to do this. Now, here's the thing, is that Nelson, even despite his awesomeness, he had already defeated Napoleon in the Mediterranean around Egypt. He ends up getting sniped. The guy was pretty flamboyant. I mean, he stood out. He was easy to see. He didn't really try to hide. He was very kind of maybe cocky and arrogant. And he got sniped and died as a result of this. Only a few could, at this point after 1812, only a few countries really were independent. And that is Portugal, Sweden, the Ottoman Empire, and Great Britain. Portugal was in the process of the French were trying to take it over. They were trying to take the entire Iberian Peninsula and already had kind of taken Spain, right? The reason why I say that is because Spain resisted, and they continued to resist even though Joseph was on the throne. But Sweden was still independent. Ottoman Empire was still relatively untouched, and Great Britain was able to put up a great resistance because they were not defeated. I mean, they were able to stop the French invasions. Remember, Great Britain is an island, okay? So, in order for Napoleon to get there, he would have to beat Nelson. He couldn't do it. So other countries were taken over or forced into alliances. Now, the only other exception here is that whereas these countries are independent, Russia was independent as well, but they were in alliance still. So that's the reason why I'm not counting them over here, because these countries here were still kind of resisting. But Russia was in a true alliance. Napoleon and Alexander I became actual friends. After the last coalition, they were buddies, or like bessies, and they would hang out and things like that. So it was pretty funny. All right, so there are going to be 3 major blunders that Napoleon is gonna do that's going to bring about his downfall as the ruler of France. We're going to talk about those in the next video. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.